That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back, everybody, to our weekly podcast. Good to see you again, Ben. We've got a great running order today, so I guess we should jump straight into it, shouldn't we?
Let's.
And see what our first item is, which is taking the knee and impartiality. So this is a quite an interesting outcome that was written up in the Telegraph this week, and it concerns a report by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, Fire and Rescue Services. And what that report has shone a light on, really, is the very real effect of sort of partiality and politicization of our institutions, in particular the police. And so things like taking the knee, which we saw during the 2020 riots and protests, or wearing rainbow lanyards by the police officers, or I guess even sort of dancing the Macarena, it undermines public confidence. And there is a sort of no expletive Sherlock response to what this report has found out. But I think it is important. It was commissioned by Suella Braverman when she was Home Secretary. One of the things that really piqued my interest in this report is in police behaviour on non-crime. A non-crime hate instance, which we've spoken about before, and which are very pernicious and hideous and Orwellian, which is that because police officers and police forces are doing things like taking the knee, they are wearing rainbow lanyards, they are getting political on all sorts of issues. What they're doing is trying to play it safe when it comes to non-crime hate incidents, and they're recording too many. And within the report, they reviewed 120 cases, and inspectors found that the forces had recorded 16 NCHIs, and indeed, worse than that, 14 hate crimes, actual hate crimes, when there was no requirement to do so. And there's a quote here that says, "A risk-averse culture and lack of knowledge among officers and staff contributes to unnecessary and incorrect recording of NCHIs and hate crimes." So, I mean, my response was no expletive Sherlock, Ben. We knew this. It's been kind of just shining a light and bringing together the strands of evidence that have always been there. But on the other hand, this is an important, especially in the context of the free speech troubles that we're going through since the new government came in, this is an important touchstone, at least something that people can use when arguing the case for free speech and for free expression.
We did some research, I think it was published last year, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, looking at the extent to which police forces across the entire country offered training or made their staff and officers undergo training on freedom of speech. And the results were pretty dire. And I think you can see that filtering through into the findings of this report. And you can imagine all too easily a situation where someone, some troublemaker has come in and said, "Oh, Joe Bloggs has said this awful thing to me." And the police officer who's dealing with that situation just wants to sort of fob them off with something. And so they say, we'll record this hate incident. There'll be a record of the case. If anything happens again, this will all be kept on a file. And you can just imagine so easily how this would be used by police who perhaps did not understand what effect this would have on the individual against whom the incident was recorded. And they're just using it to just kind of get rid of troublemakers. And of course, as we've discussed extensively, the effects for people who have an NCHI recorded against them, it can be really disastrous. And we've seen people lose job offers, for instance, because they have this incident recorded against them. And they might not even know about it. And one of the things that I'm very keen to explore, Tom, is the extent to which police are complying with the guidance that was issued under the former Conservative government to notify people when an NCHI is recorded. And I suspect that, I don't know if this report deals with that particular point, but I suspect that that will not be happening, and that we will continue to have the problem of people not being notified when a record is made against them.
Yes, I think that is an important thing that came out with that new code of conduct, which of course is now under threat from the new government. And another thing I remember from when Suella Braverman brought out that sort of statutory standing code of conduct. It had statutory standing because she had the right to sort of issue this code of conduct, and then the College of Policing had to make it operational, make it happen. What we noticed as well was that in the guidance issued by the College of Policing, the examples given in how to interpret and incorporate this new NCHI code of conduct were all tilted towards being anti-transgender ideology was often deemed a sort of NCHI rather than being anti-gender critical or getting at people who have gender critical views being deemed an NCHI. We would prefer NCHIs weren't there at all, but the examples they gave tilted the balance, tilted the scales once again towards ideology and away from good old-fashioned common sense. I think another thing that struck me, Ben, is your point about police officers not getting free speech training, this point about how the code of conduct from Suella Braverman was interpreted, and now this finding that this politicization is not helpful, is a lot of police officers, many of whom are only free to speak now because they're retired, but there are a lot of police officers now going on to various radio stations, various programs, and saying this stuff and saying, yes, there is a capture. There is something that's going very badly wrong when it comes to freedom of expression in our police forces. And that's very helpful as well. So there are a number of very helpful things on this side of the argument. But my goodness, it's a war at the moment with the direction that the government's taking.
Can we just go back onto the question of symbols like rainbow flags and rainbow lanyards and police cars painted in rainbow colours and so on to show support for the LGBTQI plus community?
You missed a letter out.
Well, there'll be new ones added by the time this episode goes out. It's bound to be out of date. There's nothing we can do about that, Tom. But the point I was going to make about this, and I'm sure you can foresee where I'm going to go with this. If the police decide it's their business to go out of their way to show solidarity with individual minority belief identity groups, clearly it is highly partial which groups are selected and which ones are not. Church-going Christians in this country are now a tiny minority of people, and it's inconceivable, and rightly so, that the police would decorate police cars with a crucifix or with any overt religious symbolism in order to reach out to that community. And yet, as we've seen over many years now, there is no such hesitation with manifesting institutional support for LGBTQIA plus. I remember the A that time. Identity politics. And so, once again, two-tier policing absolutely manifest in the choice of which groups are going to be represented through lanyards and painted police cars and all the rest of it, and which ones are not.
And how disastrous that is. I mean, it's obvious how disastrous that is. It's obvious that if one group is treated differently to another, that is in many ways the antithesis, in every way, is the antithesis of democracy, and leads to political prisoners. It leads to the ideas of sort of Soviet Russia. And if you're a political prisoner, you either get shot or sent off to Siberia. Whereas if you're a less of a worry to the authorities because you're just burgling, or you're just mugging someone, or you're just doing something violent on the streets, then you get a much lesser sentence because you're much less a threat to the state if you're a normal common or garden burglar than if you are a political prisoner and saying the wrong things about the state to the state. And it does worry me, and I'm sure our viewers, our listeners will have very, very strong views on how far we are down this road. I think we're a lot further than we might think.
Well, the police have been transformed. I think Pete Hitchens is brilliant on this, and I'm paraphrasing, but he makes the argument that the police have been turned into sort of force of paramilitary social workers, I think is his phrase, and a sort of state EDI militia, which is certainly how it appears. And his proposal, I think, is just effectively to abolish the police gradually,
yes.
And start a new police force from scratch, to which the current cases and investigations of the existing police force would be transferred in due course. I suspect we're quite a long way from anything like that happening. But you really do. I think even in our in the last 10 or 15 years, I have felt a transformation in what the police represent, and they've become a much more European style government agency rather than policing by consent without fear or favour. And that's not, I think it's fair to say, not just sort of gut feeling that I or we have about it. You can see this day after day after day. Certainly this summer we've seen it. We've seen it in the distinction between how Muslim protesters, well, perhaps I'd be more accurate to say rioters, armed with weapons were treated compared to others. And you see it in the choice of which identity crusades are endorsed by the police. It's a completely ruinous position to be in, and with all the other stuff that the police have been dealing with as well, Sarah Everard and all the fallout from that, all of these scandals, they're just in a pretty intractable mire, aren't they? And so much of it is self-inflicted. It didn't need to be like this, and we're going to come on to another institution which has been captured. So much of it is self-inflicted and avoidable, and you could see all of this happening years in advance if you were paying attention to it.
And fearful of being labelled, whether it's racist, whether it's homophobic, whether it's transphobic. People in the police force have been terrified. Very senior people have been terrified of being labelled something. And that is that's a root cause, I think, of a lot of this, that things have been allowed to get out of control because of this fundamental fear at the top, which is a toxic fear. You cannot sit at the top of an organization like the police force and be more frightened of being labeled something than of doing your basic job without fear or favor. And it really does feel that is a big thing at the heart of this. But anyway, shall we move on to an article you printed out? You were obviously reading The Sun this week, Ben. Is that your regular paper?
Well, it's not.
I sound like a snob, don't I?
Say. But I thought that this article was excellent, and it's from a Labour MP, Graham Stringer, who has gone out of his way, considerably out of his way, to criticise the government's decision to sabotage the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, against which the Free Speech Union has mounted a judicial review in order to get the act enforced as it should be, as Parliament instructed that it should be. And he has written an excellent article that came out on the 13th of September, that I would encourage everyone to go and read. And I think it underscores the point that we have been making throughout this battle ever since the government's decision to axe the act was announced, that it is not, in fact, a conservative hate speech charter, as government sources put it. It's something that cleared through Parliament in a cross-party way. In terms of our casework and the sorts of people that we're in contact with, who the act would help, it's students, academics, visiting guest speakers, all sorts of people who, if you gathered them in a room, would agree about very, very little. It's an ideologically diverse group of people. Clearly, there are themes of who is being cancelled, and if you're a gender critical feminist or you're pro-Israeli or whatever, those people have been targeted very heavily for cancellation and by vicious university internal politics. But nonetheless, it is not something that is just being done to protect conservatives. There are people across the political spectrum who need the protection that this act would confer. So I thought it was excellent to see a Labour MP going so far out of his way to criticise the government's decision.
And it still shocks me. Well, it doesn't shock me. Nothing should shock us in the current times. But it shocks me that there was a government source that labelled the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act a sort of Tory hate speech act or bill. And as you say, yet it had gone through the whole process. It had been amended in many, many ways. And still gets that sort of, it's too easy, isn't it? It's far too easy to give it that ridiculous label, but good to hear that Labour MPs are sort of offsetting that and giving the other side.
Yeah. And there's serious resistance to what the government has done. I think it's fair to say that academics have really mobilised against it, and the Times suggested that there was some hope that the government would be preparing for some kind of rethink. I don't know how optimistic that is or isn't, but certainly I think there's been a ferocious backlash against the government's decision to sabotage the act.
Well, we talked about a report that has showed that the politicisation of the police is dangerous. We've talked about a Labour MP who is battling against the cancellation of this Free Speech Act. But thirdly, another thing in the battle for free speech, the battle for free expression, is data. And obviously that's a topic very close to my heart, which is why this news item absolutely leapt out at me, Ben, when I saw it. Last week it was reported in the Times that the census figures for the number of transgender people in England, which had been 262,000 people, about 0.55% of the population in England and Wales, that's been formally downgraded after there were fears that the question itself was really fundamentally flawed. And also, curiously, when you analyze the data, as always, data has its own voice. It sings at you when you look at a data set. It tells you about itself. And you didn't need to go far into this data to see it was ludicrous, because it turns out that most transgender people were in high Muslim population areas such as Tower Hamlets in London. And you think, well, have they necessarily understood the question? And the question was, is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? Which is, for you and me and for our listeners, pretty easy, obvious to understand. But actually, there's a lot of kind of sort of acrobatics within that, because we've learned to speak this new language about transgenderism, about gender stuff, about sex stuff. We're in it. We swim in these waters. So we understand what that's saying. But if you're just doing your census, you're going to go, no, yes, no. And it's clear that's what happened. So in terms of this story, that data's now been downgraded. And it really is significant, because it means that census data, which is used for so many things, and we talk about the importance of data, has not proved not to be reliable and needs to be looked at again. And also in a very ferocious battle, in a very ferocious part of the culture wars, which is the issue of transgenderism and how significant that issue is within our population.
Yes, and I think the point about the phrasing of the question, we were talking about sort of obscure theological disputes that required quite a lot of prior contextual knowledge in order to understand them. And I think that question, as you've said, Tom, requires the reader to know what the questioner is driving at. Because if you're not familiar with the distinction between gender and sex, if you're not aware of these issues, if mercifully you've been away from social media for the last 10 years and enjoying your life, and you're oblivious to all of this, it's just completely incomprehensible. Doubly so to people who are not native English speakers or who are not English speakers, full stop. And it's so clearly going to be misunderstood. The mind boggles at the process by which this went through what you imagine must be a strenuous process of review and revision, and correction and all the rest of it in order to get the census questions in their final form. How on earth this question survived to the point where it was being posted through people's letterboxes?
I suspect an EDI officer might have been involved at some point, and this is the problem with having EDI officers and EDI training courses, which are themselves political, embedded across sort of civil service departments, including departments like the Office for National Statistics. And I was wondering, it really makes you think, why are these stats so critical? Why? And it doesn't take a lot of thinking for you to realize, well, first of all, they're needed to make sound economic decisions. We have scarce resources in this country, and we need to allocate them appropriately to the right groups in the right way. They're needed to inform debate so that good policy decisions get made. But also, and I think this is the key one in this case, is to shine a light on public interest issues, especially where they're controversial, because data ought to be the objective. Now, I know it's never, lies and statistics. I do know that there is that kind of big, important question mark over data. But you've got to have something against which you line up your arguments and you say, well, this has been done impartially, put together independently, at arm's length, in order to help us move the debate on, or at least to have a more informed debate. And when it's a hot button issue, such as this is, and it's leading to things like Scotland's new acts on transgender recognition, or hate crime act stuff, where should we redefine this as a hate crime? Well, let's look at the
conversion therapy.
Sorry?
Or conversion therapy.
Or conversion therapy. How many resources need to go towards it? How big an issue is it? Then this is critical. The stats people need to do their work. They need to be absolutely left to do their work with no involvement. And of course, they need as well to be able to put the uncertainty around their work. And we've talked about this before as well. If you've only got a tiny sample, then unfortunately, we know the headline ends up being the result of that tiny sample. Instead of saying it's a tiny sample, and by the way, it could be up to 5 times up or a fifth the other way. It really is a huge range, which is why one of the tricks I do when I look at stats is to look at things over time. And the consistency over time is one of the most powerful things when you're doing statistics, is to say, okay, fine, I don't know what that number means. You've collected this many people are transgender. What was it last year? What was it 5 years ago? What was it 10 years ago? That is the way to really get underneath an issue as well. Of course, we can't do that with this specific question, because I think it was the first time it was included and the first time they tripped up over themselves. So it really is lose-lose when the stats are wrong. And we've had this come up again in many departments within government. We've talked about migration statistics and how crime statistics in particular are split by nationality. Well, they don't publish this data anymore because it's deemed we're not trusted to know this information anymore. Well, you might do something dodgy with it. It might kick off the riots again or something like that. We're not trusted anymore to have a look at objective stats out of our Office for National Statistics. And I find that very, very concerning, worrying, and perhaps not surprising.
That's where this becomes a freedom of speech issue rather than a cultural issue that is adjacent to freedom of speech, but not directly applicable. Because freedom of speech is among other things, the right to impart and receive information. And if, as you've said, Tom, we're no longer trusted to be able to receive or handle this particular information, then I think quite clearly that is a freedom of speech issue. I also think it's storing up all sorts of trouble and kicking the can down the road, clearly. So I think it's well within our remit to be talking about these issues. There are instances, of course, where there are elements of the debate about protecting women's rights and trans rights, which are adjacent to freedom of speech, but not necessarily issues for us. But we have become so heavily engaged in that topic through the sheer volume of people who've been cancelled for expressing their beliefs on it. We have not yet had a single case where somebody has come to us and said, I've been cancelled for my pro-trans rights views. If we were contacted by such a person, we'd be very diligent in defending them, assuming what they said was lawful, and so on, and met all of our usual criteria. But the weight of that particular debate has been crushingly one-sided in terms of who is being cancelled and who is doing the cancelling. And on the question of the migrant data, we see lots of stuff from civil servants, people working in government departments or for arm's length bodies and that sort of thing, talking about the internal culture that they're dealing with, the sort of nonsense investigations that they're contending with. And I don't know what the exact figure is off the top of my head, Tom, but we have a lot of people in the civil service who are desperately concerned about what's going on, because they're dealing with the same situation that we've just been talking about, the ONS, where you've got a central mission. That's what your department or your agency has been focused on for decades, or in some cases centuries. And then you have this EDI takeover, and suddenly you have this super objective that has placed itself above everything else, above all of the core mission and core work of the body that you work for. And this has happened, as we know, across government, across the police, the ONS, and so on. And we are doing everything we possibly can to help people in those organisations to fight back and expose their concerns.
Non-crime hate incidents is another interesting area from the perspective of data, because the argument is always used with non-crime hate incidents. We need to record them so that we can see the patterns. We can see where things are happening, so we can see what regions are changing over time, what kind of hate incidents are being reported. And we've done a lot of work on those, and we've gone to a lot of police forces and got a lot of information out of them. The one thing that strikes me is it's utterly inconsistent. It's quite rightly caveated heavily by all police forces, as it should be, because you look at the data, they pulled it from a live system. It's got all sorts of markers on it. Different constables are different in the way that they record the NCHI, and maybe the markers that they put on it in terms of, is it race, is it sex, is it disability, or is it something else? And so you look at this data and you go, what can we genuinely infer other than total numbers recorded? What can we genuinely infer from it? And so on the one hand, they're collecting it in order to capture patterns. On the other hand, the data is collected in such a haphazard way, and certainly not in a consistent way across constabularies, that you think, well, what can you actually do with this? And I was pondering whether or not, something like the Office for National Statistics should actually take hold of these and start recording them in a more systematic way, and requiring police forces to submit more systematic data so that everyone can then look at this stuff and work out what's going on. But on the other hand, do we really want to institutionalize something as hideous and Orwellian as a non-crime hate instance? So we're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we want them to go away. On the other hand, for as long as we live with them, we want to know what they mean and what they're doing. And so I don't know what the answer to that is.
I'm always just that. I mean, just reading news stories generally, seeing what's going on, but dealing with these issues, particularly when we're talking about freedom of speech matters and collection of government data that's within that sort of remit, you're just left with the impression that the British state does not know what the British state is doing, that it has got absolutely no idea about, looking at the data about how many trans people there are in the country, the data it does have on migrant crime, it does not want to share. Clearly, the government has no idea, and has not for a long time, how many people live in the country. And all of this stuff is just chaos, absolute chaos everywhere, apart from the stuff that they really don't want us to be talking about.
Yes. And there's laser focused on stopping us have our free expression. Everything else is a dog's breakfast.
Yeah.
Should we finish, Ben, today with a quick dip into a very interesting article that I saw?
Yes, I like this.
Sorry?
I liked this.
Yeah, Greg Lukianoff from the US. I think he's in the US. He wrote an article in Gillette. Is it Gillette or Quillette?
Quillette.
One's the best a man can get, and the other is a fantastic online publication. Yes. That's an embarrassing mistake to make.
Plow on, Tom. Plow on.
But anyway, within this article, there are 12 assertions about free speech, which are really interesting. And he argues that all of these assertions are allegedly arguments against free speech, but they can all be knocked down quite quickly. So the first one, for example, is free speech was created under the false notion that words and violence are distinct, but we now know that certain speech is more akin to violence. Number two is free speech rests on the faulty notion that words are harmless. And I was looking down this and I thought, this is great. And he puts out the arguments as to why they are false, specious, spurious arguments against free speech. And I had a couple that jumped out to me. But Ben, let's start with you. What jumped out to you from these 12 assertions?
Can I pick one that I think is the most compelling?
Yeah.
The best argument against freedom of speech. This is assertion number 10. You need speech restrictions to preserve cultural diversity. Now, I think that probably is true. I think that we are seeing that in policing and all of the issues that we talk about every week, Tom, where the state is becoming more and more repressive. We've seen that certainly in the reaction to people talking about the riots this summer, in order to preserve cultural diversity and more particularly to preserve the peace between different ethnic and identity groups. Now, I don't think that's a sacrifice I want to make. Thank you very much. I'd much rather have freedom of speech, no matter how chaotic that becomes. But nonetheless, I think that argument that you need speech restrictions to preserve cultural diversity, I think whether or not government ministers speak in those terms, I think that is the assumption that guides much of what the British state, the police particularly, now do. I think that is the operating assumption that they have.
I liked assertion 12. I believe in free speech, but not for blasphemy, because I could immediately reword that. I believe in free speech, especially for blasphemy. I think that's kind of the point. It's where there's a group that's saying, but not for here, not for there. That's where we need it. That's where we need the light. That's where we need to turn the torch on and actually have a little bit of free speech. Very similarly, assertion 7, hate speech laws are important for reducing intolerance, even if there may be some examples of abuse. And I think they really give away the game there, where they recognize that if you try and crack down on intolerance using hate speech laws, there will be abuse of those laws because it's for this greater good. And there's always a greater good, isn't there? Whether it's the protection of a particular religion, whether it's the protection of a group and perceived intolerance of that group, then it's working out what your pyramid of good things is, and how far down that pyramid free speech is. So people who say free speech but are always just picking a layer in that pyramid, and then everything above is sacred. But I prefer not to have anything being sacred.
Can I pick assertion number 9, which is that restrictions on free speech are okay if they're made in the name of civility, which is a very American argument, I think, that has been imported into British politics, particularly with the kind of the question of social media abuse of members of parliament, Twitter and whatever. And I think this idea of sort of high-minded republicanism is, I think it's rubbish and rot, Tom. I think it's complete rubbish. Yeah. I'd much rather have the raucous English political tradition than the sort of stuff you see on C-SPAN, which is incredibly dull, incredibly dry. And as we've seen from American politics in the last 10 years, from the latest attempt to assassinate Donald Trump, it doesn't mean that people stop being angry about politics. You can see actually there are some really funny comparison videos that I've seen floating around on YouTube, comparing debate in the House of Commons and Prime Minister's questions versus what goes on in Congress. obviously our tradition is so much more colourful. It is not noted for its civility, and I think it's much the better for it. I think
we're also very much better at chanting in the football stadium, I think.
Yes, but I think actually one of the problems with civility, and I think actually this is a problem with the English national character, is that we are too polite, and I think that lots of the stuff, particularly around the trans issue, and also around migration and race and all of those sorts of issues, is that people have been so polite that we have painted ourselves into a terrible corner, and I think there is actually a case for being bit ruder, actually.
And on that note, let's be ruder this week coming, shall we? As long as the police aren't knocking on our door, but we don't know where that line is anymore. No. So we'll just see if we're still here this time next week. Yes. But thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you to everyone for watching, and we will see you next week.
Goodbye.